Hello, hello. Good evening. Um, it has been, wow, yeah, it's really been a week. And so normally, right, like I schedule these in advance and realized I had forgotten to do so. There we go. So I was like, oh no, how am I gonna uh basically yeah, like keep an eye on myself? Um, hmm. I feel like there might be some technical challenges this evening. Okay, there we go. So, um, I think that I have shared this before, and I'm going to share it again. So, I stream through my desktop computer, and then I keep the live to the side to make sure that I'm keeping an eye on comments and I'm greeting people as they come in and all of that kind of fun stuff. And so I had the mobile live to the side on my phone, and I couldn't see myself, and I went, does this mean that there's something the matter? But it's working now. So, which is really, I would say, generally speaking, pretty good news. Um, yeah, I think it's a little bit funny in an ironic sort of a way that uh, this week is the week that we're kind of talking about parenting because just in my personal life, a lot of parenting stuff going down. Um, One of which I kind of have a plan aside for later if Clyde joins us. Um, if not, I'll just share it at the end. Um, but I don't know. Yeah, it's just been real lifey these last few weeks. Um, and frankly, that's just kind of how it goes down sometimes, isn't it? Now, as we're talking about feminism and parenting, this is one where I'm drawing pretty deeply on my own lived experience, both as somebody who is currently a mother, and somebody who was also raised with the expectation that that was going to be like my main job. Now, I would argue that for myself personally, that being a parent absolutely is my most important job. And unfortunately, we live in a society where parenting is actually not where I spend the bulk of my time, even though I wish that that was a little bit different. So I'm really kind of drawing up on that in the module this week because, right, I'm not the only one that is excuse me, who is at odds with her parenting identity. Now, the first article that I point to this week uh, is a little bit outside the norm or what has been the norm right, for us these last few weeks in Introduction to Gender Studies. Um, Now, I honest to goodness don't remember if I have shared this with you all, um, but I was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as Mormons. Now, I don't practice that faith anymore, but at this point, I think it would still be fair to say that that's the faith that I practiced for the majority of my life. So it's had a real deep impact, right? Um, And so, with that in mind, I really wanted to start with something that was somewhat formative to me, um, in how I was starting to conceptualize mothering, as I entered adulthood. Now, the Mormon Church has two like global conferences every year. They're televised globally. The leaders of the church speak to the membership. Um, Honestly, like as a logistics enterprise, is extremely impressive. Right, because the talks are translated into the native tongues of people who are members of the church from across the globe, which I think is pretty cool. But if you look at who's speaking, it might be pretty obvious to you who is the target demographic, right, of the Mormon Church. And this talk, this 2007 General Conference talk, which is what those events are called, is called Mothers Who Know. And it's given by Sister Beck, who at the time was the president, was the General Relief Society president. The Relief Society is the name of the women's organization inside the church. So if you're a woman and you go to women's only meetings, you go to Relief Society meetings. And she discusses within her talk that women who are holy or like divinely focused have the desire to bear children. And that more than that, that mothers who hold their responsibility as sacred are going to put their children in homes on display in such a way that shows that they are honoring the covenants that they have made to God. Now, when I heard this talk live, I was 19 years old. Uh, so, right, a very new adult. And, oh, hey, Vanley, I'm glad you could join us. And I remember listening to that talk and feeling somewhat thoughtful, yeah, a little bit empowered, but it gave me a lot more to think about than to really feel. And so when I had selected this talk to talk about in this module, then I was rereading it as somebody who has now been a mother for over a decade. I really found myself feeling furious rather than feeling empowered because of the focus on appearance. And even when she talks about leadership, she's talking about leading through very prescriptive models. Also, never taking a break is something that is featured really heavily in this talk. And that's something that I think that is really harmful to anybody who would be in a mothering role. However, I do believe that there are some key ideas that she got right within this perspective, and that could be adapted to kind of living life through a feminist lens. Uh, and that is that mothers should take their promises seriously, and not with the intent of cheapening her talk in any way. But I think about the children's cartoon Bluey, which frankly you should be watching even if you um, don't have any kids. Like it's just a top-notch show. But there's an episode in Bluey about the importance of promises, um, because they are critical, right? Like our words mean something when we say them. Um, and parents should be leading the way in that, right? Showing that our promises are important. Um, and also that those who are in a mothering role have a responsibility to nurture, but that nurturing responsibility extends not just to those that we care for, but also to ourselves. Right, kind of as they say, you can't pour from an empty cup. And then through that nurturing comes sustainable leadership. Um, so that one really was right to, for at least for me to have the opportunity to think about my own mothering and the way that I was raised to think about mothering. In a way, it's somewhat disheartening, and in another way, I think it's very empowering to realize that um, that I or anybody else, right, could take something that we had been raised with and adapt it to the way that we are dedicated to living now. And that change and choice are both really critical parts of just living as a whole person. Now, kind of in contrast to mothers who know, um, the next article that I chose for this module is called Parenting is Always Political. Now, I had, of course, mentioned a few weeks ago. Forgive me, I always get really thirsty when these things begin. Um, I had mentioned kind of the makeup of the Mormon Church. Um, Now, at the time that that talk was given in 2007, Pew Research estimated that about 86% of members of the LDS Church were white. And so, in a way, right, Sister Beck's talk is really more of a commentary on what white motherhood should look like rather than as a holistic view of mothering. Um, which is why I thought it was really important to include Danny McCain's article about political parenting. Um, because McLean really invites us into this space that is a different type of sacred space than the sacred spaces that we talk about um, as people of faith. Oh, excuse me. Uh, as an aside, I had a grilled cheese sandwich for dinner tonight, and it was really delicious, but maybe a little more dairy heavy than I ought to have had right before this. So there's that. Um, because when we talk about parenting and our relationships with the those that we care for, and I'm forcing myself here for a minute to kind of quantify. When I see the people that we care for, of course, our children are amongst those people, um, but those caretaking responsibilities, like we talked about last week, can certainly extend beyond just biological offspring. And we'd be talking, excuse me, we'll be talking about that again in a few minutes here. Um, but really, providing care, despite its very taxing nature, is also extremely sacred, in my opinion. Um, Here my collar keeps creeping up. Um, and when we think about the sacred nature of building those relationships and building those bonds, um, McLean really gives us an opportunity to think about what that looks like. She shares an experience of her and her mother singing The Greatest Love of All every day before school. Uh, and she also recalls this as deeply powerful and talks about how Black mothers very specifically need to build spaces in their homes where their children and right, the broader family understands that in this space they are loved and accepted because that's not the reality of the society that we live in right now. Um, And she talks about a space where community is family. It's not just the folks within the four walls that we live in. Um, yeah, she touches on this a little bit, and I get chose to expand on it. That's not this isn't just like a right lovey feel good space all the time. It's also a space that comes with very real pain. And when we are talking about our black and brown sisters, and again, I'm using gender language as somewhat of a shorthand here. Just I want you to understand that um, that our black and brown sisters have also, in so many cases, especially, and I'm going to say especially in the United States, because as ever, that is the lens through which I am viewing a lot of this. Um, they have yearned for children, and uh, the violent patriarchal society that we have built has denied that opportunity. Um, both through families being torn apart under a chattel slavery system, and later, and unfortunately, evidence suggests that this is still happening, through forced sterilization. Um, and one thing that McLean talks about that I honestly love so much is that mothering is not just the result of care that is given by a biological parent, right? Um, and that parenting, um, particularly in Black communities, is a shared responsibility, much more than it is in white families. Um, she brings up a Center for Disease Control and Prevention study from 2013 that finds, and I quote, Black men are generally more likely than men of other races to read to, feed, bathe. I'm just noticing a typo in our written module. Sorry about that. Mm. Back to the quote. And play with their young children on a daily basis, whether they live in the same home as the child or not. Now, we've debated up to this point, like kind of where to go at the end of this quote. And so now you're seeing this struggle in real time because clearly debate is still ongoing within myself. Um, but parenting in a system that consistently denies you resources to parent in a socially typical way are deeply political, but also necessary. Um, now, because we live in this right, like a really relatively violent, hypermasculine, patriarchal, capitalist system, um, doing family as part of a village is extremely unfamiliar to folks who look like me. And I think that we would do well to learn from our Black and Brown brothers and sisters to build these types of systems. Um, again, while being conscious of our invisible knapsacks that we talked about a few weeks back. Um, and I think when we're talking about very particularly how um, Black families behave in the United States, um, I personally cannot ever think about that without thinking about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Now, hopefully you're a fan also, but and if you're a fan, you probably already know that Avery Brooks, who played um, ultimately Captain Sisko in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, um, partially took that role because he saw the power of being a black single father, um, parenting his child in a way that values connection, um, and respect in really kind of an unfamiliar environment. So if you want to see, honestly, just like a really top-notch example of what um, parenting can look like, and maybe a type of parenting that's going to challenge some of your preconceived notions, do yourself a favor and uh, head on over to Paramount Plus to watch Deep Space Nine, or if you are understandably boycotting Paramount Plus, go to your local library. They're all on DVD. You can watch them on disc. Um, and no, I'm not like sponsored by Paramount or anything like that. I just really, really, really love Star Trek, like so much. Um, in case you couldn't tell, really, right? Like looking behind me. Um, Now that this really brings us to our very last kind of piece of content for this evening. And that is a podcast episode. Now, I selected the first in a series, so I would definitely encourage you to watch the whole series, or forgive me, listen to the whole series. Um, I know that this is weird to say, probably, as I'm doing like a live lecture. But when it comes to like content that I will recommend, especially in this class, it's going to be something that you read, or it's going to be audio only. Uh, Somebody who has also made podcasts and is hoping to maybe find the bandwidth to get back into that at some point. Um, I am an audio first and audio mostly only type of a lady. So, and the accidental gay parents is from before there was this like, oh, your podcast absolutely has to be video. No, they're audio only. Um, which makes it really helpful for those of us who are on the go constantly. Um, Now, if you have been basically not living under a rock, you know that parenting can be a really wild ride. And it's a wild ride whether you choose parenting or not. Forgive me, speaking of parenting, I heard one of mine sneak in a snack. So there's that. Um, but with the accidental gay parents, um, Tristan and Biff had maybe kind of a wilder ride than parenting, or to parenting than most of us did when they became parents to Tristan's nephew and niece. Um, Now, through this first podcast episode, they really talk about their journey of becoming first foster parents and then adoptive parents, um, and kind of working through some of their own stuff, which, if you can work through it before becoming a parent, like, absolutely recommend it. But um, you really probably ought to have a therapist, like, on call when you do become a parent. Um, because stuff is going to come out constantly that is going to surprise you, and that is maybe going to make you react in ways that you're not proud of. Um, but so they're working through their stuff. The kids are working through their stuff. They're all, um, and they have been a family now for like over a decade, right? This podcast episode came out in 2015. Um, but their experience is, I think, such a powerful one, right? Because they uh, also became parents um, somewhat before gay marriage was legal in the United States. Um, and it really has only been within the last few years that it's been, forgive me, I'm trying to think of how to describe this. Um, I would never say that adoption is easy. Um, but it is at this point, we're a few years into it being just as hard for homosexual couples as it is for heterosexual couples to adopt children. I think that's how I'm going to put that. Um, right, they were doing all of this before any of that really became anything even close to a social norm within our society. Um, but then Tristan and Biff ultimately um, pushed the boundaries even further as a gay but transgendered couple. Um, and you might have seen them in the news actually at the time, um, that they had a biological child as well. So their adventures in parenting really kind of highlight the diversity of what families can look like, and frankly, what families should look like in a system that values authenticity and self reflection. Um, and as I probably sounding like a broken record at this point, making decisions that are good for themselves and those around them, um, that frankly aren't anybody else's business as long as it's not hurting them, which um, Tristan and Biff are not hurting anyone. Right? Um, and so that really, um, when we think about how we're approaching parenting, um, there is so much radical about what it is that we do. Um, I know I shared at the beginning that it's really been a time for my family with the parenting, and I'm going to share just an experience from today. One of my children um, has some pretty significant challenges. Um, and today, not for the first time, um, she wasn't getting on the bus home from school. Uh, and I had at the beginning mentioned that if Clyde was going to join us, I would tell this tale, but um, also as an explanation to him, Clyde and I, who he joins us very often, and I appreciate it so much. He and I also work together, and I had sent him a question and then got the call that, yeah, you got to come get your kids from school. You've got one that's not getting on the bus. And so I kind of ghosted him, and I feel really bad about that. But yeah, I'll chat tomorrow, and it'll be totally fine. Mhm. But when I think about this experience, right, again, not the first time that this kid has not gotten on the bus at the end of the school day. Um, Either through refusal or because the adults in the building with the parents could realize that it was just going to be a really bad idea to get this little human onto a bus. Um, when I think about how me and my spouse were raised, uh, what what would the consequences have been? I can tell you that they wouldn't have been very good for a variety of reasons. Um, and so to uh, get my child home and to essentially deny preferred activities. and to instead lean into connection as much as possible. That's radical parenting. Um, I think it's going to lead to a better outcome. Frankly, I don't care if you don't think it's going to lead to a better outcome because it's also not hurting anyone, right? Um, and so when we think about like feminist parenting, that really is what we're talking and thinking about, right? Um, as with almost every area of kind of approaching life through this feminist lens, uh, it's really being self reflective and thoughtful about the decisions that you are making before you make them. And so, really, the phrase that I use for my kids, and also sometimes the students that I'm working with in my day job, there's absolutely no harm at all in just slowing your roll. Like, just slow it down a little bit. Um, excuse me. And be thoughtful about what it is that you are doing. And as much as you can, try to articulate why you're taking the action that you're taking. Um, Now, that's all that I have for you this week, but I am very excited to be joining you next week to talk about gender and education. Because after all, that's all why we're here, right? So I will see you next Wednesday, October 27th at the same time. Thanks. Bye.